This is not only one of the most solid openings in chess, but it is also one of the most boring openings to crash immediately. Like you have to work for your meal and play chess for days before you finally find a way through, which is why I'm here to show you a simple system that you can use against any fianchetto setup for white, including the English opening. Now, before I proceed, it's important to understand that people who play these kinds of openings, especially the Zuckertort opening beginning with the move knight f3, are positional players, or they just want to play positional chess and not interested in quick tricks or checkmates. They just want to play chess for a long period of time if necessary. With this long intro, let's get started. By the way, what I'm going to do is to show you how to play the setup that I want to introduce against 5 different openings, namely the Zuckertort, the English opening, Queen's Pawn Game, the Nimzo-Larsen attack, and the bird opening with pawn to f4. So stay tuned. Say white plays knight f3. At this point, you don't know exactly what they are up to. You don't know whether they will transpose back to the English with c4 and g3, or go straight into the Catalan with those highlighted moves, or maybe they just want to play the normal Queen's Gambit setup, or perhaps the Cole or the London. I mean, there are so many things that white can do from here. So my recommendation for now is you start with pawn to c5. Now this is called the Sicilian invitation. Point is, maybe white may go back to the King's Pawn Game, and now it'll become easier for you to play moves like pawn to d6 and transpose quickly into the Sicilian defense. But this is not what this video is all about. Most people who start with knight f3 just want to play pawn to g3 on the second move. And now this is when you want to play d6, and immediately they play bishop g2 like they always do. Now you can simply go pawn to e5 rather than going home. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the setup I'm talking about. So picture this like the reversed Staunton Cochrane that I showed you in my yesterday's video. From here, your next plan is to go knight c6 followed by knight ge7. This is how you're supposed to develop your knights. Never think of putting your knight on f6 in this particular system. There's a reason for that. We don't want to entertain demons such as bishop g5. See, your dash squad bishop will sit on g7, and later on you will play pawn to h6, castle short, put your king on h7, whoops, like that. Someday, your last squad bishop will most of the times be going to e6, then you play queen d7, a6 or a5, rook b8, pawn to b6. I mean, let's see what most people do on leeches. So from here, you can see with your own eyeballs, that the top played move is castle short by white, after which you can go g6 or knight c6. All up to you. I love knight c6 because it kind of stops d4 after c3 in some lines. Again, you can see the top played move is pawn to d3. Now, what did I say? Your next move should be knight ge7. This is how you're supposed to be developing your king's knight. Like in my previous opening recommendation for white, knights are supposed to be defending each other in this way when you're playing a fianchetto system. Anyway, people play knight bd2 for some reason. That's the top played move, you can see. And now this is when you can go pawn to g6. After pawn to e4, the top played move, you then go bishop g7. Let's say pawn to c3. Again, that's the top played move you can see in the leeches database. Now you can simply castle short. What do they do? Rook e1. This is when you can go pawn to b5 if you want, knowing that your knight is well defended on c6. But let's finish up our setup. Pawn to h6. You don't want to allow any of white's pieces to sit on g5. Besides, your other plan is to put that king on h7. What do people do here? Let's dive it a little bit. Say pawn to a4, the second most played move. Whenever you see a4, just play a5, followed by rook b8. That's a more standard move. So you see, I wouldn't mind playing a5 just to simplify things in this position. And after something like knight c4, I would play bishop e6 because my last squad bishop belongs on this square. That's what I said. If white allows, I would just take that knight and double up their pawns like that. So people play knight e3 in this position. And now, up to me to go queen d7, pawn to b6, rook b8, or queen c7, whatever I want. But keep in mind that when you enter the middle game, the best thing you may try is to focus on the center of the board. In this case, I would immediately go pawn to f5. This is your main pawn break. If ef, most likely you want to take back with your g pawn. Nothing will reach your king here. Remember, You want your g file to be opened like that. Sooner or later, you are going to play pawn to f4 and open up the f file like that. Still watching without subscribing? Come on. The more you subscribe, the more you encourage me to do more and review more stuff. Anyway, now I said you can also try to play this same system against the English opening. Let's see if that can work. After pawn to c4, I propose you go e5 so that you stop pawn to d4 for good. In some lines, English players play knight c3 or pawn to g3 in this position. Knight c3 is the popular move, after which you can try to go c5. Of course, pushing pawn to c5 creates a weakness on d5, but that'll be stopped by our king's knight, which will sit on e7. Anyway, people continue with pawn to g3. You can see now you can go knight c6. If bishop g2, you simply go pawn to d6. Again, welcome back to your pawn structure. What do people do on lichess? They play pawn to e3, maybe wanting to play d4 next, but that doesn't count. Once again, you don't want to go knight f6. This will kind of delay your development, even though it's not much of a stretch. You want your king's knight to sit on e7. Now you will see white doing the same because this is what they do in the English opening. They also play knight e2 to keep an option to go f4 in the near future. By the way, that's what we are also doing with knight e7. We want to play pawn to f5 later in the game. That'll be our main pawn break. After that, you may consider to play g6, and after white castles short, play bishop g7, pairing to castle short as well. Now let me just do something here. Of course, the top played move is pawn to b3. Sometimes people play pawn to d4. But what if white rushes out with a move pawn to f4? What do you do? Whenever you see these kinds of committal moves or aggressive moves, pause a little bit to see what your opponent is up to. Can they play pawn to f5? Give it a chance? No. So the only option they have is pawn takes, and we would be glad to take back with our e-pawn. So in this case, I wouldn't bother to play pawn to f5 as well, even though that's okay. Instead, I would castle short or play pawn to h5. But anyway, this is for another day. Castle short. What else can they do? Fe, then de. Still maintaining your pawns. Knight d5 is the top played move, but you can simply take. If they take, now you relocate your queen's knight to the king's side. Play knight e7, or even better, knight b4 in this position. I mean, look at that. Also, you are planning to put your knight on d3 if white allows. For example, pawn to e4, knight d3. You just leave your knight at that square. I've seen some people playing queen b3 here, which is a blunder. Why? Because of pawn to c4. If queen takes, simply go queen b6. This is just a little trick. If king that, you go knight f2 check. Of course, white should take to give up their rook. You'll be up on exchange. Say white plays king g1. What can you do in this position? Wait a second. If you thought knight h3 check is winning due to queen g1 check, congrats for blundering easily due to knight takes g1. There is no checkmate because of this. But always pay attention to what is happening on the board. There is no smoothed mate here. What you can do instead of going knight h3 is to play knight takes e4, grab some free pieces. White has to play something like d4 in this position, after which you go knight d6. That was checked, by the way. This attacks the queen, so they have to do something about this. And I mean, in this position, black is doing better. Now, the question that begs to be answered is, can we achieve this same pawn structure even against the queen's pawn game? The answer is yes. And that usually transposes back to the check Benoni defense. How does this go? You go pawn to c5. Most people play pawn to d5. You can see that's the top played move on lichess. Now, instead of playing pawn to d6, right away you go pawn to e5. Now, let me explain. If white takes with ampersand, in most cases you want to take back with your f pawn. And I mean, this is the pawn structure that you're going to have in the middle game. You will develop your pieces normally and have a semi-open file for your king's rook. Most people don't even do this. If white plays pawn to d6, trying to block your that's what bishop from being developed, I mean, this is just a blunder of the century due to queen b6. Look at that. So if you don't have a cool weapon against queen's pawn game, try the old Benoni defense, which oftentimes transposes to the check Benoni. It becomes the check Benoni after playing knight f6, by the way. The top played move here is pawn to c4. And your plan is as follows. You want to go d6. to create that same pawn structure I talked about. And after something like knight c3, you can go pawn to f5 if you want. You can also go bishop e7 first, then knight f6 and knight b e7. We'll look at that. But sticking to our plan, you go g6. Say after e4, simple development, you go bishop g7. Say bishop d3. This is what people do. Now here, even though you don't have knight c6, you can still go knight e7, preparing for pawn to f5. Anyway, if knight ge2 is played, an example, you have all sorts of things that you can do. Knight d7, a6, even f5 or castle shot, ready to go pawn to f5. For example, after castle shot, you can even go pawn to f5 right away, because if white doesn't take, you intend to push that pawn to f4. You just have to take. Now this is when you can take back with either your g-pawn or your knight. I love taking back with a knight in this position because the intention is to put that knight on d4. And maybe the queen's knight will be developed like that. So that's another way you can play this setup even against the queen's pawn game. Maybe let's talk about the b3 Nimzolassen attack. For those of you who don't have a special weapon, you can consider this same setup which works like magic. For example, you can start with pawn to e5 here. White is going to play bishop b2 like always. And then you go pawn to d6, kind of the fillet or defense. Now the top play move here is pawn to e3. You can see this is what people do in the Nimzolassen attack. Now this is when you can quickly play pawn to c5, forming up your pawn structure. It's not the best move in the world, but again, it's not the worst. If d4 comes right away, you see, you can do this, and after pawn takes, if you want to be slow and solid, you go knight d7. Point is, if pawn takes, you want to take back like that without having to worry about exchanging your queens. Okay, let's do this. Pawn takes, bishop b5. If that happens, you have queen a5 check. You're going to win the light squad bishop, so white has to play knight c3. They just blocked their own dark squad bishop. Now this is when we can play s6, and after bishop takes, we go bishop takes, ready to castle long if we want. And these are moments where you're going to see your opponents playing knight e2. Now you can play castle long, or if you're risk averse, go knight f6, bishop e7, and castle short. It's not much of a stretch, but since I don't listen, I would play castle long in this position so that if this happens, now I go bishop c6, also attacking the queen. And look at that. The last opening where you can play this setup is against the bird's opening, the f4 opening, which usually transposes back to the stone wall attack. The white plays pawn to f4. You don't know what to do. You don't have a proper weapon, but this, yes, d5 is playable, even pawn to e5 and then that. But people who play pawn to f4 know their opening theory very well. So you better go pawn to c5. Try to confuse the enemy. They'll play knight f3. They always play that like robots. So now you go d6. You already know your plan. If pawn to e4 is played or d4, you play this in the style of the Sicilian defense. And as you know, the Sicilian is one of the most dangerous responses to one e4, if not the best. So you don't have to worry about that or about moves like pawn to d4 or e4. You just transpose back to the Sicilian defense and will be good. At this point, your opponents will play moves like pawn to e3, just something they are used to in the bird opening, right? Now, this is when you can play moves like knight c6, that. For example, I'll play knight c6 in this position, preparing to go pawn to e5 if white allows. They usually play bishop e2 because they want to castle short. Again, knight f6 is not part of our vocabulary if you remember very well. So it is in positions like this where you want to play pawn to g6 to castle short. You go bishop g7 after something like pawn to c3. Now this is when you go pawn to e5. Again, welcome back to that same pawn structure. If fe, you take back with your d pawn. Now, particularly in the bird opening, you will see most of your opponents responding with d4 immediately. In this position, what you can do is just to take with your c pawn, simplify the position. They'll do the same, and then up to you to go queen b6, knight ge7, or knight f6. As for me and my family, would play ed. So that after ed, now that's when I would go knight ge7, preparing to castle short. And look at this big weakness here. And that's it, you guys. One setup against 5 different passive openings. And hey, don't just watch. That's not encouraging at all. To keep this channel alive, you can simply share this video, hit the like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have nothing to say, just type "Thank you, Kaspa" in the comment section down below. Lastly, if you want to go through my study PGNs, such as the one I'm using in this study, you can visit my Patreon page. The link is in the comment section down below.